My father forgot my name in October and learned a dead language in November. Those two facts sat side by side in my life for 4 months and I could not get them to fit, and I still can't, and I have stopped trying. What I do now is tell it in order and let other people fail to fit it together, which is at least company. My name is Thea. I was 44 that winter, an only child, and I had moved back into the farmhouse at Offshore in September because there was nobody else and because the alternative was a place with a laminated menu on the wall and a television on all day, and I had promised him. That's the whole reason. I had promised him in a car park in 2011 after a scan, and he had said, "Don't make promises you'll resent," and I had said, "Too late." Offshore is not a village. It is a long low farmhouse and 2 collapsing barns at the end of 2 miles of unmade track, in a landscape that people from elsewhere call bleak and that I have never been able to see as anything but correct. Flat black fields. Dikes and drains, straight as rulers, cut 300 years ago by men who thought they were finishing the job. In winter the fog comes off the water and sits in the fields at chest height so that you can stand at the kitchen window and see the tops of the hedges and nothing underneath them, and the whole world looks like it has been sawn off at the waist. There is one other house on that track, half a mile back, and it had been empty since 2019. My father's name was Emlyn Voss. He was 78, he had been a drainage engineer for 30 years and a beekeeper for 50, and he had a disease that we had been told to expect and that arrived anyway like a stranger. I will not spend long on the dementia. You either know it or you are lucky. It is not a fog and it is not a fading, whatever the leaflets say. It is a demolition, and it is done from the inside, and it takes the good rooms first. By the October he had lost my name. He had not lost me. He knew I was his, and he knew that I was to be trusted, and when I came into a room his face did the thing it had always done. But the word Thea had gone somewhere and did not come back, and he called me love, and duck, and once, terribly, mother. That was the ordinary grief. I was managing it. There was a rhythm to the days, up at 7, the long slow business of dressing, breakfast, the radio, the bees in the afternoon if the weather allowed, which by then it mostly didn't. A carer called Nadia came 4 mornings a week and was better at all of it than I was. The first night was the 11th of November. I woke at about 2 because the house was talking. That's the only way I can put it. A voice, low and steady, coming up through the floor from the room below, which was the front room where we had put his bed because the stairs had become impossible. And my first thought was that he had the radio on, because he did that sometimes, and my second thought, as I came down the stairs in the cold, was that it was the wrong radio, because the voice had no music behind it and no pauses in it. He was sitting up in bed in the dark. Not agitated. Not distressed. Sitting up straight with his hands on the blanket, in the position of a man being interviewed, and he was speaking, fluently and continuously, in a language I had never heard in that house. I stood in the doorway for a long time. I want to say it was 30 seconds and it may have been 5 minutes. Then I said, "Dad." And he stopped and turned his head toward me, and in English, in his own voice, he said, "I'm sorry, she's talking, I can't always get a word in." Then he lay down and went to sleep. In the morning he had no memory of it, which meant nothing, because he had no memory of most things. It happened again on the 14th, and the 15th, and after that on perhaps 4 nights out of 7 for the rest of that winter, always between 1 and 3 in the morning, always the same performance, sitting up, hands on the blanket, speaking to somebody at the foot of the bed. I recorded it on the 18th of November on my phone, because at some point in every one of these stories somebody records it, and I want to tell you what recording it actually does, because it isn't what you think. It does not give you proof. It gives you a file that you now have to decide what to do with, and the deciding takes years. The language was Latvian. I found that out in 9 days, through a translation agency in the city and a woman called Ilse Berzina who was, I think, the single most important person in this entire account, and who charged me £40 an hour and then stopped charging me. She listened to the first file and phoned me back within an hour and said, "Where did you get this?" I told her. And she said, "Your father is Latvian?" I said no. My father was born in Wisbech. My father's father was born in Wisbech. My father had been to France twice and Ireland once and had complained about both. And Ilse said, "This is not just Latvian. This is a dialect. It's Latgalian, from the east, and it's not modern. I would say it's the way my great-grandmother spoke. There are words in here I have only seen written down." I asked what she was saying. And Ilse went quiet and then said, "Mostly, she's giving instructions about a house." That was the first of 41 recordings. Over the winter Ilse transcribed and translated them all. She would not take money after the fourth one. She was in her 60s, she had come to England as a child, and she told me at one point, in a very level voice, that this was the most Latgalian she had heard spoken since her mother died in 1998, and that she had found herself looking forward to the files, and that she was aware of how that sounded. The voice was a woman's, in content if not in sound. It came out of my father's throat in my father's register, but everything it said was a woman speaking. She referred to herself with feminine endings. She spoke about her husband, her sons, her sister-in-law who was a fool. Her name, she said twice, was Bronislava. And what she talked about, night after night, for 4 months, was housekeeping. I need you to understand how strange that is, and how much worse it is than anything dramatic. She talked about how much flour was left and whether it would see them to the spring. She talked about a leak over the porch and a man called Jacobs who had promised to see to it and had not. She talked about a cow with a bad foot. She talked about her son Anton's, who was 12 and would not wear his good coat, and she was exasperated about it, in the specific exhausted way of a woman who has had the same argument 9 times. She was not haunting anybody. She was doing her evening. Once, on a recording from January, she broke off in the middle of a sentence about firewood and said, in a completely different tone, "Is somebody there?" I had made a noise in the doorway. A floorboard. And then she said, and Ilse's translation of this is the thing I have never got past, she said, "There's a woman in the doorway again. She stands there every night and she doesn't help." I stopped standing in the doorway after that. I sat in the chair by the window instead, where he could see me, and I want to be clear that I did that for entirely practical reasons and that the practical reasons were a lie. Here is what happened in February. I had done what everyone does. I had looked for the ordinary answer, and there are ordinary answers available, and I want to lay them out fairly. The first is cryptomnesia. A person hears a language in early childhood, a neighbor, a prisoner of war, a farm worker, and the memory sits unused for 70 years and then a failing brain releases it. This is documented. It is rare and it is real, and it was my working theory for 11 weeks. So I went looking. And the truth is I found something. There were Latvian agricultural workers in the fens after the war. Displaced persons, thousands of them, placed on farms across Lincolnshire and Cambridgeshire in 1947 and 1948. My grandfather's farm, which was this farm, had 2 of them, and I found the names in a ledger in a box in the attic that my father had never thrown away because he never threw anything away. 2 men. Arvids and Pederis. Surnames given as best the English clerk could manage. 2 men. No women. And my father was born in 1946, so he was 1 and 2 years old. I took this to Ilse and she said something that I think about constantly. She said, a child of 2 absorbs the sound of a language, yes. He does not absorb a woman's household vocabulary from 1930s Latgalian. He does not learn the word for the wooden peg that holds a particular kind of gate, which your father used on Tuesday, and which I had to look up. Then she said, and Thea, this woman is not describing a farm in England. She's describing a farm with a stove built into the wall between 2 rooms, and a byre attached to the house. That's a Latgalian farmstead. That is not any building you have ever been inside. The second ordinary answer is that I was doing it. Not lying. Constructing. A woman alone in a house on a phone watching her father disassemble, and a mind that wants a story with a person in it rather than a disease with none. I have taken that one very seriously. I have taken it to 2 professionals. It does not survive the recordings, and it does not survive Ilse, and it does not survive the last thing, which I will get to. What changed in February was that Bronislava started to notice me. Up until then she had been going about her evening in a house I could not see, occasionally irritated by a woman standing in a doorway. In February she began addressing me. Not by name. She never had my name, which somehow made it worse, because my father didn't have it either, and there were 2 of them in that room now who knew exactly who I was and could not say it. The recording from the 9th of February, translated, goes like this. She said, "You're still here." And then, after a pause, "You're the one who feeds him." I said yes. I said it in English. I had started answering by then, which Ilse had advised against and which I had done anyway. And she said, "Then you'll know. He isn't eating for 2. Tell them he isn't eating for 2, they'll want to know that." I asked who they were. She said, "The ones who put him in." That is the whole of the supernatural content of 4 months and 41 recordings. 6 words. The ones who put him in. She never explained. I asked, on 11 separate nights, in English, which she seemed to half understand, and every time she either ignored me or went back to the flower. On the 2nd of March my father had a stroke, a small one, and lost the use of his left hand, and after that the nights changed. She was frightened. That's what I can't put down. The last 5 weeks of recordings are a woman becoming frightened, slowly, in a kitchen I could not see, and she did not know why any more than I did. She stopped talking about the spring. She started asking whether the door was shut. She asked, several times, whether the man was still outside, and Ilse and I never established whether that was a real man in her world or something else. And on the 11th of April, at 2:10 in the morning, with me in the chair by the window and the fog outside doing what it does, my father sat up and said, in Latgalian, very calmly, "I think this is the end of it, and I am sorry that I have been in your way." Then he said, in English, in his own voice, "Thea, help me with my boots." He had not said my name since October. I said, "Dad," and he looked at me and he was there, he was completely there, more there than he had been in a year, and he said, "We've had somebody in with us, haven't we?" I said yes. And he said, "She's been very good about it." He died 8 days later, in the afternoon, in that same room, with the window open because it had turned mild. There were no more recordings. She did not come back for the last 8 nights, and I sat up for every one of them. Ilse came to the funeral. She had never met him. She stood at the back in a good coat and afterward she took both my hands in the church porch and said something in Latgalian and would not translate it, and she said, "Ask me in 10 years." I asked her in 9. She had a stroke of her own in the 8th year and her daughter phoned me, which was kind, and I never got the answer. There's a last thing. In the summer after he died I cleared the attic properly. 40 years of a man who never threw anything away. And in a tea chest under a rolled carpet I found a bundle of letters that had nothing to do with my family. 11 of them, in Latvian, in a woman's hand, addressed to a man at this farm, at this address, postmarked between 1948 and 1951, and never opened. Arvid's. The one in the ledger. He had come to England in 1947 and he had left in 1951 for Canada, according to a note in my grandfather's hand, and 11 letters had arrived for him and had not been forwarded and had not been thrown away, and had sat in an attic in a wet county for 70-odd years, in the dark, above the room where my father slept. I had them translated. Not by Ills. By the agency, formally, with an invoice. They are from his wife. She stayed. There was no way for her to come, and then there was a border, and then there was no point. They are about flour, and a leak over the porch, and a man called Jacobs who had promised to see to it. They are about a cow with a bad foot. They are about their son Anton's, who was 12 and would not wear his good coat. The last one, from the November of 1951, says that she has heard nothing for 3 years and that she will keep writing until she is told to stop, and that she does not mind the silence as much as she minds not knowing which room he is in when he reads them. It is signed Bronislava. I have thought about this for 11 years and here is where I have arrived, and it is not an explanation, it is only a shape. She wanted to know which room he was in. Nobody ever told her. And the letters went into the dark of an attic in a house on a farm and stayed there while a boy was born underneath them, and grew up underneath them, and got old underneath them, and then, at the very end, when the walls of him came down, something that had been waiting 70 years in 11 envelopes finally found a room it could get into. She thought she was in her own kitchen. She never knew. For months of a dead woman doing her evening in the head of a dying man who had never met her, going through the flour and the firewood and the boy's coat, and getting frightened at the end without ever being told why. I burned them. I want to say that, because people ask, and because there is a version of me that thinks it was a crime. I burned them in the yard on a still evening in July, and I stood there until there was nothing, and I said, out loud, feeling like a fool, he's not here. He's in the churchyard at Thrive and there's a lime tree over him and it's the third room on the left, and I'm sorry it took so long. The smoke went straight up. There was no wind at all. And I went inside and slept 11 hours, which I had not done in 2 years, and when I woke the house was only a house. Only that. Which is the part nobody warns you about. My brother came back from the water knowing everything he had ever known, and one thing he shouldn't have, and the second thing was that he was left-handed. Ives was right-handed. 34 years right-handed. He wrote right-handed, threw right-handed, held a cigarette in his right hand in a particular way that I could pick out in a crowd from 40 feet. He had a callus on the inside of his right middle finger from a lifetime of pens. He came out of the estuary at Corin Sands on the 18th of March after 11 minutes in 4-degree water, and they got his heart going in the ambulance, and he was in a bed at Art Hallow General for 9 days, and on the 4th day I gave him a pen and a form to sign and he took it in his left hand and signed it without pausing. The signature was correct. That's what I need you to understand. It was his signature, the same loops, the same stupid flourish on the S, executed with his left hand at first attempt. I said, Ives, and he looked up, and he looked at the pen in his hand, and he said, huh. That's all. Huh. And he put it in his right hand and finished the form, and we did not talk about it for 4 months. I am Cor. He was my twin. Not identical, we never looked much alike, but twins in every way that turns out to matter, which is to say we had the same childhood in the same rooms at the same time, and neither of us has ever been able to describe it to anyone who wasn't there. We grew up on the west coast, in a place called Balmar, which is a scatter of houses along 4 miles of single-track road on the south side of a sea loch. 900 people in the parish in 1980 and perhaps 300 now. The mountains come down to the water on both sides and the sun goes behind the ridge at 2:30 in December. There is one shop, one church that opens twice a month, and the sound of the loch, which is not the sound of the sea, it is quieter and more continuous, a kind of long breath that you stop hearing at about age 6 and start hearing again the moment you leave. Our mother was still there. Our father had been dead 11 years. Ives had never left, he had a boat and a shellfish license and a house up the Bray, and I had left at 18 and come back at 31, which is a very common story in that parish and nobody makes anything of it. The accident was not mysterious. That's the first thing I always say. He went out alone on a falling tide to shift creels, in March, which is stupid, and everybody in Balmar does it, and the boat took a wave over the stern in the Narrows and he went in. A man called Tam Muirhead saw it from the road and got him out with a rope from the pontoon, and Tam is 71 and I have bought that man a drink every week for 9 years and will until one of us dies. 11 minutes in the water. Cold water drowning does strange things. It preserves you and it wrecks you, and the neurologists at Ardhallow said what neurologists say, which is that we would know more in 6 months, and that they were cautiously very pleased, and that some subtle changes were to be expected. Some subtle changes were to be expected. I have thought about that sentence for 9 years. He came home in April. He was thin and slow and got tired at 4 in the afternoon and cried at things on television, all of which we had been told to expect. And he was correct. That's the word I have, and it is a bad one. Let me try to do better. He knew everything. Every detail of our childhood, tested by me relentlessly and shamefully over that first summer. The name of the dog we had until 1994. The exact wording of a joke our father made about the minister. What was under the loose board in the back bedroom, which was a cigarette packet with 2 cigarettes in it that we put there in 1997 and never smoked, and which was still there, and which I went and checked at midnight like a lunatic. He knew the boat. He knew the grounds. He went back out in July and worked the same lines in the same order and caught the same weight. He knew our mother's routines and her tablets and which of her stories to interrupt. And he was left-handed about 11% of the time, and he cut his food in the continental way, holding the fork in his left and not swapping, which our father had specifically and repeatedly told us was a thing we did not do, and Ives had mocked me for doing it once at a wedding in 2009. And he had stopped hearing the loch. I asked him about that in August. We were sitting on the wall outside his house at about 10 at night with the light still just about in the sky the way it is up there in summer, and I said, "Do you hear that?" He said, "Hear what?" I said, "The loch." And he listened, properly, for a good while, and then he said, "No. Everyone in Balmar hears the loch when they come back to it. Everyone. It is the single most reliable thing about the place. You go away and you come back and for about a fortnight it is deafening and then it goes again." He had been away for 9 days and had nearly died, and he did not hear it in April and he did not hear it in August. I want to be careful here. I am not going to tell you that my brother was replaced. I have never said that sentence out loud in 9 years, and I am not going to start now. What I am going to tell you is what I observed, over 4 years, with a notebook, because I am that sort of person and because it was the only thing that kept me from going under. He was cold. Not unkind. Cold in the sense of temperature. He ran 2 degrees below where he wore a jacket in July, and he put his hands round mugs and left them there. He was kinder. Genuinely, materially kinder. This is the thing nobody expects. Ives had been a difficult man. He had a temper on him and he held things for years, and he had not spoken to our cousin Fergal since 2013 over nothing at all. Within a year of the water he had made it up with Fergal. He had started driving our mother to her appointments without being asked, and he had a patience with people in the shop that I had never once seen in 34 years. He had no interest in music. He had played guitar badly and constantly since he was 15. The guitar sat in the corner of that house until 2021 and was then given away, and when I asked, he said, "I've lost the thread of it." And he watched people. That's the one that gets me at 3 in the morning. He watched people the way you watch a subject you are studying and expect to be examined on. Not staring, nothing so crude. But in a room, in a pub, at a funeral, if you looked at Ives he was almost always looking at whoever was speaking, with a kind of steady mild attention, and when they finished he would say something correct. Correct. There it is again. Our mother knew. She never said it and she knew. She died in the February of the 3rd year, and the week before she died she asked me to sit with her, and she held my hand in the way she did, and she said, "Soror, when I'm away, you're to keep an eye on your brother." I said of course. And she said, "No. Listen to me. An eye on him." I asked her what she meant. And she looked at the ceiling for a long time and then she said, "When he was wee, if you gave him a sweetie he'd eat it before you'd finished handing it over. Now he says thank you." That was all she had. A woman of 81, for days from the end, and the evidence that her son was not entirely her son was that he had started saying thank you. It sounds like nothing. It is the most damning thing anyone has ever said to me. Here is the climax, if it is one, and it is very quiet. In the autumn of the 4th year Ives asked me to go out on the boat with him. This was normal, we did it perhaps twice a month. We went up the loch on a flat grey day with no wind and the tops in cloud, and he cut the engine off Ardmore Point, where it goes to about 40 fathoms, and he let us drift, and he sat down on the gunwale opposite me and he said, "I want to ask you something and I want you to not answer straight away." I said all right. And he said, "Do you think I'm your brother?" I did not answer straight away. I want that on the record. I sat on a boat in flat water in the middle of a sea loch with the man who had been born 11 minutes after me and I did not answer for what must have been half a minute. Then I said, "I think you're my brother." And he nodded slowly and looked out at the water and he said, "That's the right answer, and I think it's true, and I'd like to tell you what it's like." And he told me. He said that he did not remember the water. He said the last thing he had was standing up in the stern with a hand on the creel rope and thinking about whether he had enough diesel, and then a gap, and then a ceiling in Ardhallow. He said that when he woke up he knew everything and it was all where it should be, but that it was like a house he had been given the keys to rather than one he had lived in. He said, "I know what's in every cupboard. I have to open the cupboard." He said that he did not feel like an imposter and had never once felt frightened, and that this was the part he could not explain to anybody, because it should have been terrifying and it simply wasn't. He said, "Whatever this is, it isn't hostile to me. It might be me." Then he said the thing I have never told our family. He said, "Soror, sometimes I think I did drown. And I think what came back is everything about Ives that could be written down. And whatever couldn't be written down is still in the water at the Narrows, and it's fine, and it doesn't mind, and I'm the one who has to do the rest of it." I said, "That's the worst thing I've ever heard." And he said, "Aye. But somebody has to drive Mum to the hospital. He's 52 now. So am I. He is, by every measure that a community uses, a good man and a better one than the original, and there are perhaps 4 people alive who know there is a question, and 2 of them are us. I look for it, still. 9 years. I catch him with a mug in both hands in a warm room. I watch which hand takes the change in the shop. I have never once heard him mention the sound of the water. And here is what I have come to, out on that same lock, on my own, more times than I can count. I don't want the answer. Because there are only two, and one of them is that my brother had a hypoxic brain injury with a lateralization effect and a personality change, which is medicine, and which is boring, and which is almost certainly the truth. And the other is that something came up out of 40 fathoms of cold water in March and took the shape of a man so completely that it inherited his kindness debts and paid them, and drove his mother to her appointments, and sat with her at the end, and has been quietly, patiently, without complaint, being a better son and a better brother than the one it replaced, for 9 years, and asking nothing. If that's what it is, then the honest question is not what is it. The honest question is whether I would give him back. And I sit out there on flat water off Ardmore Point with the engine off and the tops in cloud, and I know exactly what my answer is, and I have never once been able to say it out loud. My son started keeping accounts in the 3rd week of his fever. He was 15. He had never kept accounts of anything in his life. His room was a crime scene, his school bag had a banana in it from the previous term, and I had spent 2 years being told by teachers that Wilder was bright and disorganized in exactly that order. And then he had a fever of 40 for 4 days in the January, and on the 6th day, sitting up in bed, still gray, he asked me for a notebook and a ruler. A ruler. That's the detail that turned me cold before anything else did. My name is Sennett. I was 41. We lived in a mill house on the edge of a town called Ketterdown, my husband Oral and myself and Wilder and his sister Bee, who was 9. The mill had not been a mill since 1930 and had been converted badly in the 70s and beautifully in the 90s, and we had bought it in a market dip and could not have afforded it a year later. It sat over the race, which is a channel of water cut off the river, and the water ran under one corner of the house through a stone culvert, and you could hear it everywhere, in every room, all the time. A constant low running. When we viewed it, the agent called it a feature, and I remember laughing. That was the first winter that the water was high. It had rained since October. The race was up over the sill of the culvert, and the sound had changed from a run to a kind of pressing. Wilder got sick on the 6th of January. For days of 40 degrees and the doctor twice and no diagnosis beyond viral, which is what they say when they mean we don't know and you'll be fine. He was delirious on the 2nd night and shouting, and on the 3rd night he was quiet, and on the 4th the fever broke at about 4 in the morning, and I was there and I felt it go, actually felt it, his skin cooling under my hand in about 20 minutes. 2 days later, the notebook and the ruler. He ruled columns. 4 of them, in pencil, perfectly straight, with headings. The headings were, what was taken. From who? When? Still owed. And then he began to fill it in. I did not see the pages for 3 weeks. He was 15 and I was not in the business of reading my son's notebooks, and God help me, I was pleased. He was tidy. He was going to bed at 10. He had asked, twice, whether he could help with something. The first thing that was properly wrong was the handwriting. I found a page torn out and screwed up in the kitchen bin at the end of January, and I flattened it out on the counter to see whether it was homework, and it was a list of 9 items in a hand I did not recognize. Small, upright, heavily slanted to the vertical, with a long descender on the Y, and the number 7 crossed. My son wrote in a barely legible forward sprawl and had never crossed a 7 in his life. Nobody in our family crosses a 7. My mother-in-law did. Oral's mother, Yannick, who had been dead 6 years and who I had disliked in the honest way that is easier to live with than pretending. She was Belgian, she came here at 19, She crossed her sevens and put a bar through her z's and wrote in that same upright, tight, entirely legible hand, and I had a card from her somewhere in a box and I found it that night at 11 o'clock and put it next to the page from the bin. They were the same hand. Not similar. The same. I did not tell Oral for 9 days. I want to account for that. He had lost his mother badly, they had unfinished business of the specific kind that death makes permanent, and I was 41 years old holding a piece of paper from a bin and a birthday card from 2016 and I could already hear how it would sound. So instead I read the notebook. I did it on a Tuesday while he was at school and I have never regretted anything less. It was 40 pages by then and it was an accounts ledger, and it was about our family. What was taken? From who? When? Still owed. Entry 1, dated in that upright hand to a year before I was born. A sum of money, a name I didn't know, and in the last column, a figure. There were 61 entries. They went back to 1931 and forward to the previous November. Most of them were small and domestic and absolutely mundane. A borrowed coat, not returned. A sum lent for a car and repaid short by £40. A promise to visit and not kept, with a value assigned to it, and this is the part where I stopped being able to read it as a strange hobby, because how do you assign a value to a visit, and yet there was a number, and the number was in the same currency as the £40. There were 14 entries that involved Oral's family. And there were 3 that involved me. Mine were correct. I want to say that as flatly as I can. One of them was a thing I did in 2004 to a woman I worked with, a small unkindness with a large effect, and I have never told a single living person about it, not Oral, not a therapist, nobody, and it was in that notebook in the correct year with the correct name and a figure in the last column. I sat on the floor of my son's bedroom with the water running under the house and I understood that I was not dealing with a phase. Oral came home at 6. I met him at the door and gave him the notebook and he read it standing up in the hall with his coat on for 20 minutes. Then he went and sat on the stairs and said, "My mother did this." I said, "What?" And he said, "She had a book. When I was a boy. She kept a book of what people owed. Not money, mostly. She called it, and then he said a word in Flemish I have never been able to spell, and he said, it means the reckoning, but softer. More like the tally. He said, she used to say, nothing is ever forgiven, it's only unpaid. He said, I have not thought about that book in 30 years. We did all the sensible things and I will summarize them because they took 9 months and led nowhere. The GP. A pediatric neurologist who found nothing and used the phrase post-viral, which covers a great deal of ground. A CAMS referral with a 14-week wait. A very good clinical psychologist called Dr. Ridout who saw Wilder 11 times and who I think about often. Wilder was, throughout, entirely well. That was the difficulty. He slept, he ate, his grades improved sharply, he was pleasant and helpful and calm. He had friends round. He was, if anything, easier than he had been at 14, and every professional who met him said a version of, he presents very well, and I wanted to take them by the collar. He would not discuss the notebook, but not evasively. He answered questions about it the way you answer questions about your job. It was a task he had. He did it in the evenings. He said, once, when I pushed, it's not finished, and I asked what happens when it's finished, and he said, then it gets settled. Dr. Ridout asked him who had asked him to do it. And Wilder said, nobody asked. It just wants doing and I'm the one who's good at it. Which is, I want to point out, exactly what any conscientious 15-year-old would say about anything. The escalation, if that's the word, was extremely gradual, and it was not frightening in the way I had braced for. Nothing flew across a room. Nobody spoke in a voice. What happened was that he started collecting. In March he cycled 11 miles to a village called Hurst Elmore and knocked on the door of a house belonging to a woman of 83 called Verity Sallow, and he asked her, politely, for a coat. She phoned us. She was not upset. She said on the phone in a very steady voice, more interested than anything. Because she had had my husband's mother's coat since 1974. A green wool coat, borrowed at a funeral, and Yannick had asked for it back twice and Verity had said she would drop it round and had never done so, and it had hung in her spare room for 50 years and she had, she said, thought about it perhaps once a year for half a century. She gave it to him. She said, he was very nice about it. He said, thank you, that's the coat closed then. That's the coat closed then. Over the following 4 months my son settled 9 entries. He wrote letters. He made phone calls. He paid, out of his own savings, £110 to a man in Sheffield who had been shorted on a car in 1989 and who cried on the phone, according to Wilder, and then got angry, and then cried again. He went to see Oral's Aunt Ilse in a home in Norwich and sat with her for 2 hours, and afterwards she told a nurse that her sister had come. He apologized to a woman in our town on my behalf. That was the worst day of my life and I am including the death of my father. He came home from school and said, I've done the 2004 one, and I said what, and he said, I went to see her at her work, and I said Wilder, and he said, it's all right. She said she'd forgotten about it, and I said, I know, but it was still owed. Then he said, she cried a bit. She said thank you. That's the one that was hurting you. And I sat down on the kitchen floor, which I seem to do in this story, and my 15-year-old son made me a cup of tea and put it beside me and went and did his homework. It ended in the November. The water was high again. Same as the year before, the race up over the sill, the whole house full of that pressing sound. He came down at about 9 in the evening with the notebook and he put it on the kitchen table in front of Oral and he said, that's it done. Oral opened it. Every entry had a line through it. 61, ruled off, in pencil, with the ruler. Except one. The last page had a single entry in that upright hand, dated to the previous January, and the columns read, what was taken, a boy. From who, and then my name, my full name, in that same hand. When, the 6th of January. Still owed, and in that column, nothing. A dash. Oral said, what is this? And Wilder said, that's the fee. Then he swayed slightly and put his hand on the back of a chair, and he said, in a voice that was suddenly and completely 15, Mum, I feel really weird. He slept for 19 hours. And when he woke up he was mine again, and he had no idea what had happened for 10 months, and the notebook meant nothing to him, and his handwriting was a sprawl, and his room was a crime scene by the following Thursday. He is 24 now. He is an accident and emergency nurse in a city 2 hours from here, which I have never once mentioned to him as being interesting, and I never will. He does not know any of this. We agreed, Oral and I, in a kitchen at 2 in the morning, that he would not know, and I have kept that for 9 years and I am not certain it was right. We still have the notebook. It's in a drawer in the mill house, under the tea towels, and I have taken it out perhaps a dozen times. Because here is the thing. 61 entries, all settled. A whole family's worth of small held grudges and unreturned coats and 40-pound shortfalls, running back to 1931, all of it closed inside 10 months by a boy on a bicycle. Oral's family is different now. There is nothing left in it that people don't say. Ilsa died happy. Verity Sallow sends us a card every Christmas. Whatever was in my son that year did more good than I will do in my life. And it charged for it. That's the entry that keeps me at the drawer. What was taken, a boy? From who, me? When, the 6th of January. Still owed, nothing. Nothing. It was paid in full at the time. I paid it and I did not know I was paying it, and I have spent 9 years trying to work out what exactly went out of my house on the 6th of January in exchange for all that peace. Because I got him back. I did. He is 24 and he is entirely himself and there is not a mark on him. But I've never got back the 4 days. I was in that room for 4 days and 4 nights while the fever ran, and I remember the first night and I remember the 4th night when it broke and I felt his skin go cool under my hand. And the 2nd and the 3rd are gone. Completely. Not hazy. Gone, the way a tooth is gone. I have asked Oral. He says I was there the whole time. He says I didn't sleep. He says I talked to him, on and off, all through both nights, and that at one point he stood in the doorway and listened, and that I sounded perfectly normal, and that I was having a conversation. He said, I assumed you were on the phone. I asked what I was saying. And he said, you were agreeing to something. For 11 months my husband negotiated in his sleep, and it took me until the following spring to understand that I was what was being negotiated for. He did not thrash or shout. That is the thing about it that made it survivable for so long. Ludo was a quiet sleeper and he stayed a quiet sleeper. He simply began, at some point after midnight, to talk, in a low even conversational register, in complete sentences, with pauses in the right places for the other party to answer. Half a conversation. Every night. For 11 months. My name is Marguerite. I was 38. We had been married 9 years and had no children by a decision we had made twice and revisited constantly, and we lived in a first-floor flat in a converted schoolhouse in a town called Beckwith Fold, in the hills, where the mist comes down at 4 in the afternoon from October to March and the whole town goes soft at the edges. The schoolhouse had been built in 1878 and closed in 1974 and converted in 2004, and our flat had been the infant's classroom. High windows, too high to see out of when seated, which is how they built them so children could not look at the weather. A ceiling of 11 feet. And a floor of the original boards, sanded and sealed, so that the whole flat had a resonance to it, a very slight ring, and if you dropped a spoon in the kitchen you heard it in the bedroom a beat later. I mention the acoustics because I lay in that bedroom for 11 months listening to a man speak into a room that gave every word back. It started in the February. He said, in the dark, at about 1:30, that's not what was agreed. I woke up properly and said, Ludo. He carried on. He said, no. No, because you said the 6th and it's not the 6th. I put the light on. He was asleep. Absolutely, unambiguously asleep, on his back, eyes closed, breathing slowly, and his mouth was making these words with almost no effort, the way you speak when you are entirely relaxed. I said his name 3 more times and then I shook him, and he woke up and was confused and slightly annoyed and had no memory of it at all, and in the morning we made a joke of it and I told 2 people at work. Sleep talking is nothing. Everybody knows somebody. Ludo had done it as a child, apparently, and his mother confirmed this on the phone with some enthusiasm, and that was, for about 6 weeks, the end of it. What changed was that I started listening properly instead of just being woken. Because it was not random. Sleep speech is famously fragmentary. It is single words, half phrases, mumbling, nonsense. This was not that. This was one side of a negotiation, conducted competently, by a man who in waking life negotiated for a living, and it had continuity from night to night. I began writing it down in April. Then, in May, I began recording it, because writing in the dark at 2 in the morning was making me feel like a mad person, and a machine felt more respectable, which tells you something about how I was managing. I have 163 recordings. I have never let anyone hear more than 4 of them. I want to give you the texture rather than the drama, because the drama is thin and the texture is what did the damage. Most of it was procedural. He talked about terms. He said things like, then we come back to the question of duration, and, I'm not going to discuss that until the other point's settled, and, you keep moving it, and every time you move it we start again. He was patient. He was extremely patient. He was, and this is the awful part, good at it. Ludo was a commercial mediator, he did construction disputes, and he had a particular manner in a room that I had seen twice and admired enormously, a sort of unhurried refusal to be rushed, and that was exactly the manner he used at 2 in the morning to whatever was at the other end of it. Twice, in 11 months, he lost his temper. Once in July, when he said, very quietly, absolutely not, and then nothing else for the rest of the night. And once in October when he said, in a voice I did not recognize, you will not do that, and sat up in bed with his eyes shut, and then lay back down. He never said what it was about. For 7 months, I want to be clear, I did not know what was being discussed. I had 100 recordings of a man conducting a negotiation with no subject in it. It was all process. Duration, terms, timings, conditions, who moves first. In September I did the thing that broke it open, and it was very boring. I made a transcript. All of it, every recording, in a spreadsheet, with dates. And then I searched it for nouns. Because he almost never used one. That was the pattern. In 11 months and something over 40,000 words there were almost no concrete nouns at all. He said it. He said the arrangement. He said what we discussed. He said, once, memorably, the property, and I sat with that for a week and got nowhere. But there were 14 instances, across the whole corpus, of the word she. And every single one of them was in a construction that made her the object. She wouldn't know. She doesn't need to. If she's not told, then it isn't consent, and we're back to the first problem. You can have that when she's ready and not before. She is not part of this. That last one is from the 11th of August at 2:20 in the morning, and it is the 4 seconds of audio I have played to another human being. I did not confront him. I want to explain why, because it is the question everyone asks and it deserves a real answer. Ludo, awake, was the same man he had been for 9 years. Kind, slightly boring in the way I had chosen on purpose after a decade of interesting men, entirely present. He remembered nothing. He was, by the autumn, worried about me, because I was sleeping 4 hours a night and had lost weight and had started keeping a spreadsheet, and from where he stood the presenting problem in our marriage was his wife. And I knew, with total certainty, that if I said, you are negotiating about me in your sleep with something, one of 2 things would happen. Either he would be frightened, which would help nobody. Or he would be kind about it, and gentle, and suggest I see somebody, and I would have to decide in that moment whether to be a woman with a theory or a woman with a marriage. So I did the coward's version, which was research. I went to his mother. I drove 90 minutes in November and sat in her front room and asked her about his childhood sleep talking, and she was delighted to talk about it, and after about 40 minutes of anecdote I asked, as lightly as I could, when did it stop? And she said, oh, when he was 11. After the business with his brother. Ludo did not have a brother. In 9 years he had never once mentioned a brother. His name was Rasmus. He was 2 years older. He died in 1994, aged 13, and Ludo was 11, and the family had done what families did then, which was to deal with it by not dealing with it, and by the time I met Ludo at 29 he had, his mother said, more or less stopped mentioning him. I said, more or less. And she said, well, he doesn't, now. He did for a long time. Then she got up and went and got a biscuit tin from a cupboard, which is how everything important in that family was stored, and she showed me 11 pages of a child's writing. Ludo, aged 11, in the year after his brother died, had kept a record of conversations. He wrote them out. Both sides. Question and answer, laid out like a play, in pencil, on lined paper. And the other party in every one of them was Rasmus. His mother said, the doctor at the time said it was very healthy. Grief work, they called it. He did it for about a year and then he stopped and he was fine. I asked if I could read them. And she said, of course, and then she said, they're mostly about the funeral. He was very upset that he wasn't allowed to go. He was not allowed to go. 11 years old, and they thought they were protecting him, and they sent him to an aunt's for the day. That was 1994 and that is what people did. I read 11 pages in a front room in the Midlands with a cup of tea going cold, and the last one, dated 8 months after the death, is a boy of 11 making a promise. He writes, R says I have to come. I said I can't now, it's too late. R says not now, later, when you can. I said all right. R says say it properly. I said I promise I will come to it. Then, underneath, in a different pressure of pencil, as if added later, I promise I will come to the funeral. I drove home in the dark over the tops with the mist coming down and I had to pull over twice. Because I understood, then, what 11 months of terms and duration and who moves first had been about. It was a contract dispute. A commercial mediator, in his sleep, spending 11 months doing the only thing he was truly good at, which was litigating a promise made by an 11-year-old boy under duress, in pencil, in 1994. And the point at issue was when. You can have that when she's ready and not before. She is not part of this. The clause he was arguing over was me. I told him. I told him in the January, at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, with a laptop and a spreadsheet and 4 audio files, and it took 2 hours and it was the worst conversation of my life and it was also, unquestionably, the right thing. He listened to the 4 files. He read the transcript of the 11th of August. He went into the bedroom and shut the door for about 20 minutes and came out with his eyes red and sat down and said, I remember writing those pages. I remember the pencil. Then he said, I have thought about Rasmus every day for 30 years and I have not been able to say his name since I was 12, and I don't know why, and I have never been able to work out why. And I said, because you owe him something. And Ludo said, I owe him a funeral. We had one. In the March, in the churchyard at Halden where Rasmus is, with his mother and his aunt and 4 people who had been at school with him and were now in their 50s, and a woman minister who was very good about the strangeness of it. Ludo spoke for about 6 minutes. He was 39 years old and he stood at his brother's grave and finished a sentence he had started at 11. The sleep-talking stopped that night. Completely. Not tapered. Stopped. 11 months of nightly negotiation, and then nothing, for 9 years, and he is a silent sleeper and always will be now. That's the ending. It is a good ending and I am grateful for it every day, and I want to be honest that I do not entirely believe it. Because there's a thing that I have never raised with him, not once in 9 years, and I am going to say it here and then I am going to stop. The negotiation was about a date. It was always about a date, that's what all the duration and timing and you keep moving it was, and I have read those transcripts more times than is good for me, and the shape of it is unmistakable. One party wanted a thing to happen, the other party kept deferring it, and eventually they agreed. They agreed in the November. I can date it. The recordings from the last 6 weeks are completely different in character from everything before. They are short and calm and administrative. On the 9th of November he said, "All right." On the 14th he said, "That works." On the 21st he said, "And that's the end of it then, and after that there are only 11 more nights of talking and they are almost nothing, just, yes, and, I know, and, I will." He agreed to something in the November. And I told him in the January, and we held the funeral in the March, and I have always let myself believe that the funeral was the thing he agreed to. But the funeral was my idea. I proposed it on the 11th of February in that kitchen. It did not exist as a possibility in November. In November there was nothing on the table except an 11-year-old's promise and 30 years of interest on it. So I do not know what he agreed to. He is 48 now. He is well. We have a good life and a dog and the mist still comes down at 4 o'clock. And every year, in the November, I do not sleep very well. I lie in that high-ceilinged room that used to be full of infants and I listen to a man breathe quietly beside me, and I wait, and nothing happens, and in the morning I am ashamed of myself. But somewhere there is a date. It was agreed by 2 parties in good faith, one of whom has been dead since 1994 and one of whom is asleep next to me, and I was excluded from those discussions specifically and deliberately and by name. She is not part of this. I have decided to take that as a kindness. Most days I manage it. My sister spent the winter holding a place for someone, and in April she asked me if I would like to meet him. She said it the way you'd offer a coffee. I want to set the scene properly because the scene is most of it. The island is called Fod. It sits 4 miles off a coast that is itself the end of everything, and there are 2 houses on it and a lighthouse that was automated in 1988, and a jetty that is usable in about a third of the tides. 11 hectares of rock and thin turf and thrift and 1 stand of sycamores that somebody planted in the 1890s and that have grown sideways. Our family has had the North House since 1971, when our grandfather bought it for almost nothing because nobody wanted it. It has 3 rooms and a stove and a generator and a well that is really a spring in a stone box. There is no mains anything. Phone signal exists in one specific place, on the west side, standing on a particular flat rock, in dry weather. My sister Una went out there in the September to write a doctoral thesis on coastal Gaelic place names and to be, in her own phrase, unavailable for a while. She was 29. I am bride, and I was 36, and I had spent the previous 4 years being the reasonable one in a family that had run out of other options. She was supposed to come back at Christmas. She did not come back at Christmas. She phoned on Christmas Eve from the Flat Rock, which she did once a fortnight, and she said the work was going extremely well and that she had decided to stay through to the spring, and she sounded fine. Better than fine. She sounded settled in a way she had not since her 20s began. She said, "I'm getting a lot done," and then she said, "And I've got somebody with me now, so don't worry about the alone thing." I said, "Who?" And she said, "Oh, he's not company exactly. It's more that I'm holding a place for him." I said, "Una, what does that mean?" And she said, "It's hard to explain on the phone, and the tide's coming, and I love you," and she rang off. 6 weeks later I went out there. I want to describe the crossing because everything afterwards sat on top of it. Late February, a boat from a man called Roraid who has taken my family out to that island for 30 years and who charges a flat price and never talks. 40 minutes of a swell coming from the southwest, gray water, gray sky, no horizon between them. Gannets going over in a line. And as we came in past the North Skerry he cut the engine early, which he never does, and he sat there with the boat rolling and he said, "Has she said anything to you?" I said, "About what?" And Roraid said, "I've been putting stores in every fortnight since November. She meets me at the jetty. She's grand. But she doesn't come down the path." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "She waits at the top and she comes down when I'm at the boat and she doesn't turn her back on the house." Then he started the engine again. She was at the jetty. She looked well. That is the thing I have to keep saying, to everyone, forever, she looked extremely well. She had put on a little weight, which she needed. Her hair was longer. She was brown from being outside in a winter that had apparently been clear. She hugged me and she smelled of wood smoke and she said, "Oh, good, you came, he'll be pleased." We walked up the path together. It's about 400 meters and it climbs. Halfway up she stopped and said, "I should say the rules before we go in." I said, "Rules?" And she said, "There's only two. Don't sit in the chair by the stove. And if he's using the kitchen, wait." I said, "Una." And she said, "I know exactly how that sounds. I've had 4 months to think about how it sounds. Come and have some tea and I'll do the whole thing properly, and if you want to take me off this island at the end of it I won't fight you." That is not what a person in the grip of anything says. I want that noted. She was completely lucid, and she was funny about it, and she was aware of exactly how each thing landed as she said it, and she said the sentence "I won't fight you" at the top of a path on an island 4 miles offshore, and she meant it, and that is why I did not take her off that island in February. The house was clean and warm and the work was real. There were 400 index cards on the wall and 11 notebooks and a chapter draft that her supervisor later described to me as the best thing she had produced. And there was a chair by the stove with a folded blanket on it. She made tea, and she sat at the table, and she told me. She said it had started in October with a sense of somebody having just left a room. She said that is very common on Fod and that our grandmother used to say the same thing and that she had thought nothing of it for weeks. She said that in November she had begun to find the position of things adjusted. Not moved. Adjusted. The kettle turned so the handle faced the other way. The door of the stove left open a hand's width, which is what you do to draw it. Her boots by the door with the toes out. She said, "At first I thought I was doing it." And then she said, "And then I understood that I was doing it, and that was much more interesting." I asked her what she meant. She said, "I mean I would come to and find my hand on the kettle, turning it. And I wasn't distressed by that, and I want you to understand that the not being distressed is the strangest part, because I should have been." She said she had worked out, over about a fortnight, that there was a set of things that wanted doing in a particular way in that house, and that they were not her way, and that she had begun doing them, and that once she started doing them deliberately rather than absently, the lapses stopped. She said, "So I do them on purpose now. I turn the kettle. I bank the fire the way he banks it. I leave the chair. And in return I get my head to myself all day and I have written 40,000 words." I said, "In return?" And she said, "Yes." I said, "Una, who is he?" And she said, "I don't know his name and I have decided not to try to find out, because if I find out then he's a person who died here and then this becomes a haunting, and it isn't a haunting, and I'm not being haunted. I'm subletting." I stayed 11 days. Here is what I observed, and it is very little, and it has taken me 9 years to accept that it will never be more. The house was warmer than it should have been for the amount of fuel we used. I measured that, crudely, with a notebook and the stove and the woodpile. 11 days, and we used about half what the two of us should have used, and the stove drew perfectly on nights when the wind was in a quarter that makes it smoke. Twice I sat in the chair by the stove. The first time was an accident on the second evening, and Una said, gently, "Oh," and I got up immediately and nothing happened. The second time was on the 9th day, and it was on purpose, and I sat there for 20 minutes with my sister watching me from the table, and what I experienced was not fear or cold or a presence. It was embarrassment. I do not know how else to describe it. I sat in that chair and I felt, with total conviction, the specific hot discomfort of having taken somebody's seat at a table where everyone knows it is their seat. It built until it was unbearable, and it was entirely social, and I got up, and I apologized out loud, and Una said nothing at all. On the 10th day I stood on the flat rock and phoned our mother and said the words that I had been assembling for a week, and I did not say them, and I said instead that Una was well and working and would be home in April. And she was. She came home in April, on Ruarada's boat, with 11 notebooks and a finished draft. She submitted in the November and passed with minor corrections. She is 38 now, she teaches at a university, she is married to a decent man called Petter, and they have a daughter of 4. She is entirely well and has been for 9 years, and she has never gone back to Fod, and the family has never asked her to. Except she still turns the kettle. Every time. In her own kitchen in a city 300 miles from that island, she fills the kettle and sets it down and turns the handle to the left, away from the hand, which is not how anybody in our family does it and is not how she did it for 29 years. I have never mentioned it. Not once. And I watched her do it 11 times over Christmas last year, and I counted, like a lunatic, and every single time. Here's the part one cannot put down. I asked her, on that last night on the island, the only real question I had. I said, what happens if you stop? If you sit in the chair and you leave the kettle and you shut the stove down tight? What happens? And she thought about it for a long time, with the fire going and the wind doing what it does out there, and she said, I don't think anything happens. I said, then why do it? And my sister said, because he's been here a very long time and nobody has done it his way since before Grandpa bought the house, and it costs me nothing, and I don't think anyone has ever asked him anything. Then she said, do you know what I actually think? I think he's not waiting for something. I think he's just still going. Like a clock in an empty room. She said, and someone should be in the room. She's happy. I want to end on that because it's true. My sister is happy and successful and loved, and there is nothing wrong with her. But sometimes at her house, late, when everyone has gone up and I'm the last one in the kitchen, I stand there and look at that kettle with its handle turned to the left, and I think about 11 hectares of rock 4 miles out with 2 empty houses on it and a lighthouse nobody tends. And I think, something is still going. Out there. Tonight. In the dark, with nobody in the room. And a woman in a city 300 miles away turns a kettle handle 9 or 10 times a day for a stranger, without thinking, for the rest of her life. I don't know whether that's the end of a possession or the whole of one. I've stopped needing to know. That's what 9 years does. But I always turn mine to the left now too, and I could not tell you when I started. The last one I have to tell you is mine, and I have to tell it from the inside, which nobody ever does, and there is a reason nobody ever does. For 14 months, between my 31st and 32nd years, I was not alone in here. And I knew it the whole time. And I did not tell one single person, and I functioned, and I held down a job, and I was at 2 weddings, and there are photographs of me from that period in which I am laughing. My name is Otto Line. I am 50 now. I am telling this because my mother died in the spring and she was the last person it could have hurt. It began in the November after my father's funeral, which is a suspiciously convenient detail and which I have always felt obliged to flag, because any competent professional would begin there and stay there. We lived, my mother and I, in a terrace on a street called Cardigan Rise in a northern city, in a house that had been in the family since 1938. It was the sort of street where the front doors open straight onto the pavement and you can hear next door's stairs. 3 stories, damp in the back bedroom, a yard with a wall too high for the sun. I was 31 and I had moved back in for what was supposed to be 6 weeks and had become 11 months by the time this starts. I worked in a records office, cataloging, which is a job for a particular kind of mind and which suited mine perfectly. My father had died in the September. Long illness, no surprises, a good death as they go. My mother was 64 and coping in the way her generation coped, which is to say by keeping the house warm and the biscuit tin full and never once saying what she felt about anything. On the 11th of November I woke at about 4 in the morning and there was somebody else in my head. I need to be extremely careful with this next part, because the language available to describe it is all wrong. Every word makes it sound like a metaphor. It was not a voice. I have never heard a voice. I want that understood at the outset because it is the thing people most want and I cannot give it to them. It was more like this. You know the sensation of having a word on the tip of your tongue. There is a shape in your mind that is definitely a specific word, and it has a length and a rhythm and a first letter, and you cannot say it. It is entirely real and entirely wordless and you would swear to it in court. Imagine that, except it is not a word, it is a person, and they are there all the time, and they have preferences. That's the closest I can get. There was a shape in me that was not mine, and it had opinions. The first thing I noticed was the stairs. Our staircase turned at a half landing and there was a runner on it and one board on the 4th step that gave underweight. I had lived in that house for 18 of my 31 years and I stepped on that board perhaps 40,000 times. On the 11th of November I started avoiding it. Not deliberately. I would arrive at the bottom of the stairs and go up and by the 4th step my foot had gone to the outside edge, against the wall, on the uncarpeted inch. Every time. And when I made myself step on the board, on purpose, standing there in the hall at midnight doing an experiment, the feeling I had was the feeling of doing something rude. Rudeness. That's the register the whole thing was conducted in. Not horror. Not violation. Manners. Over the following weeks it accumulated. I stopped being able to drink tea with sugar, which I had done for 20 years. Not a taste aversion. It was that putting the sugar in felt like an imposition on somebody. I began to find myself standing at the back window of the middle bedroom looking at the yard wall, and coming to with no idea how long I had been there, and the feeling attached to it was not fear, it was a sort of low patient waiting, and once, distinctly, disappointment. I started to know things about the house. That's the one I have the most trouble with. In the January I put my hand on the wall in the back bedroom, on the damp patch, and I knew, with the flat certainty of remembering your own phone number, that there had been a door there. I asked my mother. She said, "Don't be daft." 3 days later she came into the kitchen and sat down and said, "I've been thinking." There was. When your gran had it, the 2 back rooms went through. Your granddad blocked it up in about 1961 because of the dam. I said, "How do you know?" And she said, "Because I remember the wallpaper going up." I had never been told that. There is no version of events in which I was told that and forgot it. I have gone at that memory with everything I have, for 19 years, and there is nothing there. Here is what it was like to live with, day to day, and this is the part one most want to convey, because everything else is anecdote. It was not frightening. It was crowded. You know the particular tiredness of a long day in the company of someone you cannot relax around. Not an enemy. A colleague, a difficult in-law, a person whose good opinion you want. The constant background computation of another consciousness in the room. That, permanently. Waking and sleeping. For 14 months. I was exhausted in a way that sleep did not address. I lost the ability to be idle. I could work, and I worked very well, better than I ever have, because cataloging is a task with rules and there was something in me that liked rules enormously. But I could not sit in a chair and do nothing, because doing nothing meant being available, and being available meant the shape came forward. And here is my confession, and it is the reason I have never told this to anybody who knew me at the time. I liked her. I knew it was a her by about the March. Not from anything said. From the same wordless certainty that told me about the door. And by the summer I had a sense of her that was as detailed as my sense of anyone I have ever known, and that contained not one single fact. She was tidy. She was easily embarrassed. She was frightened of the front door, specifically, and had no difficulty at all with the back. She had a fondness for the second stair from the top, and would stop there, and I stopped there with her many hundreds of times, for no reason, on the way to bed. She was patient with me. That's the thing. 14 months of sharing a skull with somebody, and she never once did anything I would call an intrusion. She had preferences and she made them known, and when I overrode them, which I did constantly out of sheer stubbornness, she yielded. She yielded. Every time. And felt, faintly, like someone who has been overruled before and expects it. In the September, a year on from my father's death, my mother decided to sell the house. She told me on a Sunday. She had it all worked out, a flat near her sister, and she was brisk about it because being brisk was how she survived things, and I sat at that table and felt the whole of me go into a kind of freefall, and I understood immediately that only about half of the reaction was mine. That was the first time she was ever frightened in a way I could feel. Not for herself. This is the part that took me 15 years to be able to say out loud without qualifying it. She was frightened for me. The house went on the market in the October. And over the following 3 months I had what my GP recorded, accurately and I think reasonably, as a period of significant anxiety following bereavement, and what I experienced as two people trying to solve a problem with one mouth. Because she wanted me out. That was the whole content of those 3 months. It came at me in the only currencies she had, which were dread and preference and the direction of my own feet. I could not go into the cellar. I could not stand in the hall after dark. And I found myself, over and over, at the front door, with my hand on it, and the feeling was not come here, it was go. She was terrified of the front door and she pushed me at it for 11 weeks. We moved out on the 14th of January. I remember standing on Cardigan Rise on the pavement with a box in my arms and the van behind me and my mother locking up, and I felt her go. It was not dramatic. It was like the moment a fridge stops humming. A quality of noise you did not know was there, absent, and the silence rings. I stood on that pavement and I was alone in myself for the first time in 14 months, and I want to tell you what I felt, and it was not relief. It was bereavement. Straightforward, clean, enormous bereavement, in the street, in front of the removal men. I have never lived alone since. 19 years, 4 flats, 2 long relationships and 1 marriage, and I have never once lived by myself, and I tell people it is because I am sociable. Now the rest of it, quickly, because it is only facts. The house sold to a developer who split it into 2 flats. During the works, in the June, they took out the blocked doorway in the back bedroom to open the rooms up. There was nothing in the wall. I want to say that plainly, because everybody expects there to be. It was brick and horsehair plaster and a 1961 newspaper, which is a common thing to find and means nothing. But my mother's cousin Enid, who was 86 and who I visited in the November of that year specifically to ask, told me about the house. Her name was Latgalian. My grandmother's older sister. Born 1919, died 1943, in that house, in the back bedroom, of tuberculosis, at 24, after 14 months of not being allowed out of it. 14 months. Enid was very definite. She said, they had her in that back room from the January and she died the March after, and nobody was allowed in but your gran, and the doctor came to the back door because they didn't want the street knowing. The doctor came to the back door. I was named for her. I had always known that. It was a family name and I had never asked and my mother had never elaborated, and when I finally did ask, at 33, sitting in her flat with a cup of tea, she said, "Oh, my mother's sister," and then she said something I have carried ever since. She said, "Your gran always said she never got out. She'd say it at funerals. Everybody gets out in the end, except our Latgalian." I am 50. I have had 19 years to build a view and here is the whole of it. I do not think I was possessed, if possession means occupied against my will by something hostile. I think a young woman spent 14 months in a back bedroom on Cardigan Rise being kept quiet so the street wouldn't know, and then did not leave, and stayed in that house through a blocked doorway and a new wallpaper and 60 years of other people's lives, being tidy and embarrassed and frightened of the front door. And then a woman with her name moved back in. And she came into the only room that was open. She did not want my body. She never took anything. In 14 months the sum total of what she did with a living human being was to avoid a creaking stair, refuse sugar, stand at a window, and stop on the second step from the top. And then, when the house was sold, she spent 3 months using everything she had, which was almost nothing, to push me out of the front door she had been afraid of for 80 years. She got me out. She did not come. That's the last thing and then I'm finished. I have been back to Cardigan Rise twice. Once in 2011, when I stood across the road like a fool and looked at a blue front door that was not our door. And once, 4 years ago, when the upper flat came up for rent and I made an appointment under my married name and walked through it with a boy of about 24 holding a clipboard. The stairs are gone. They put in new ones when they split it. But there is a half landing, and above it, the second step from the top. And I stood on it. On purpose. With an estate agent waiting at the bottom of the stairs looking at his phone. And there was nothing. No shape. No crowding. No opinion about anything at all. Just a woman of 46 in a stranger's rented flat standing on a step for slightly too long. I said, out loud, quietly, so the boy wouldn't hear, I got out. You did that. Nothing answered. Of course it didn't. I went down the stairs and out through the front door onto the pavement, and it was raining, and I stood there for a minute getting wet. And I thought about how the whole of it, the entire 14 months, the only thing anybody has ever done to me from inside my own head, amounted in the end to one person who had never been let out holding a door open for another one. There are worse things to be haunted by. There is nothing at all worse than being the one who has to walk through.